Thank you so much for coming on today, guys. This is a little different. Normally, we kind of talk to scientists and dig into, why things happen. But I love getting the human touch too. And in honor of Mother's Day, I really want to talk to both of you about an experience that you went through less than a year ago now. And we're coming up on hurricane season again. So I think it's really good to touch upon this. Lots of safety things going on. And I think who better to get that information from than two people who lived it and two people who lived it with their kids. So thank you so much for coming on today to talk about this. I want to get a little overview of both of you too, because you're anchor moms, so we know the podcast, or at least I do. I'm going to hear more about that in a second, but I want to know what you do for WLOS in Asheville too.
All right, Katie.
I am the morning co-anchor. I've been here in Asheville, like on and off for 15 years. I've worn every hat. I have done traffic. I reported. I worked night side, day side. I was in a bureau. And now I'm now I anchor the morning show.
Awesome. And Karen?
And I am an investigative reporter here. I started on the morning show. So Katie and I worked together on the morning show for a while and then moved dayside. And now I do investigative work. And we also co-host the Anchor Moms podcast.
Awesome. Which, is such a fun podcast for anybody who hasn't heard it. Go take a listen to it. There's some great episodes from the past too. Can you give me a brief overview of kind of what you discuss on the podcast?
Oh, what don't we discuss on the podcast? We kind of just talk about all of the ups and downs and in-betweens of being working moms in 2025. We were pregnant together with our babies who are now 6, which is crazy. And that's when we started the podcast, was when we came back from maternity leave and just couldn't stop talking about everything, how we're juggling being moms and working in TV news.
Yeah. I think that's a pretty good synopsis.
Yeah.
It's madness as somebody who did it for a long time too.
Yeah.
And Karen, you have a lot of kids, right?
I do. Yes, we have 4 kids. My husband the other day texted me, I think we had too many kids. And I texted back, I think you might be right. Yes, it's correct. Of course, we love them all, but it is a very, very crazy world in our house. So yeah, but it's fun.
I am one of 4, so I can relate.
Ooh.
Katie, what about you?
So I have one, she's 6. And I think that's what's fun about the podcast. And that's what's been fun about our friendship is that Karen always has all the answers because she's been through it all. There's nothing that you can't bounce off her and she won't have a good suggestion.
I don't know if it's always the correct answer, but I can tell you what we've tried and what maybe has or hasn't worked for us. Ooh, it is a lot of just, throwing a dart at the board, right? And see what sticks when you're a mom.
Yeah. And it's so fun because your podcast, I think, really resonates with people, but also because you can tell by listening that you two are really good friends, right? I'm not making that up, right?
You're not making it up.
No, we hang out together a lot. At one point, I feel like we were realizing that we were maybe together more than we were with our husbands.
Right. Yeah.
Like it's a lot since we work together and we hang out outside of work. And it's really fun too, because we kind of had a revelation sort of recently that our daughters, who are the same age, are really good friends.
Yeah, they like each other too. Like at first we sort of force the issue at first, right? Like you're like, come on, like you guys are
you guys be friends.
Yeah, come on, let's do it. But now I think organically
they really do love each other.
They are friends, which is a huge win.
Yeah.
That worked out. Cool. Okay. So back in September, there isn't anybody in the country who has not heard of Hurricane Helene. It was devastating to the area that you two live in, and also very unusual because it was inland. You guys live hundreds of miles from the coastline. So moving to Asheville, did you ever think that you were going to be dealing with a hurricane?
No, it wasn't even part of, there's some things that you think of being here in the mountains, but a hurricane in an emergency situation, no.
Yeah. Never would have ever crossed, I don't think, anyone's minds. I mean, and there, I think some people might not realize there had been flooding before in this area. In some sections of town and different communities often are prone to flooding. There was a tropical storm Fred, several years ago that did do some extensive flooding in one particular area. But this, I think what was so unbelievable about Helene was that it was so unbelievably widespread. I mean, it just felt like
the damage
and the destruction and where the storm touched was so far reaching. I mean, so many small little pockets, little communities, but also entire bigger towns. Swannanoa, Marshall, parts of Asheville, North Asheville, Hendersonville, Bat Cave, Chimney Rock, Lake Lure. It was so many different people and communities were impacted by this.
Yeah. I mean, when we're here in the mountains, we think about we're preparing for snowstorms. Occasionally we have a tornado in some of our southern counties. But I mean, right up until it happened, I don't think anybody saw it coming. We had been warned. We had gotten a lot of rain in the days before the hurricane moved through. And our meteorologist had been warning us, but I don't know that anybody anticipated just how impactful it would be.
So take me through. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I think that even our meteorologists knew it was going to be bad and catastrophic, but they couldn't have even predicted just how terrible it was going to be. And I think one of the biggest things was the loss of infrastructure right away. I mean, I don't think people realize the interstates in 3 directions were washed out. We had no water. We had no cell service for weeks. We had it was just, our Asheville water system, was the actual plants were gone.
Failed. Yeah.
I mean, it was so beyond just some flooding and some trees down. It was a really pretty felt desperate situation, especially for that first week or so.
So in the days leading up to, you said that you kind of had an idea that there was going to be an event. In that time period, like 2-3 days, were you able to prepare it all? What did you do during that time? Or were you so caught up with having to do work because you work for a TV station? How did you prepare your family for this?
So I think that we talked about cleaning out gutters, if that makes sense. A tree fell on my house, and I will tell you, there's just really no way to prepare for a tree hitting your house, right? So we got a lot of rain, and then the hurricane rolled through on Friday morning, and that brought wind. And so a lot of the ground was already saturated. So a lot of trees came down in addition to the rivers flooding. I think that a lot of people did things like we think about when we get high wind events or rain events, like put away your patio furniture, clean out your gutters. What we probably should have been doing, and I'll be honest with you, is stocking up on non-perishable food and water, and having, you've seen those like battery packs where you can charge your cell phone. Some of the stuff we just couldn't, you can't prepare for not having internet for days on end. It forced a lot of people to get Starlink, believe it or not, which is a satellite internet system. Now people are better prepared here in Western North Carolina than they were beforehand. Yeah.
But to your point, I don't think anyone was ready for what hit. I don't think people were prepared for exactly what was going to happen and how serious it was going to be. In hindsight now, when you ask the question, it is kind of like, oh, why didn't we think more about these things? I do think also, literally, no one thought it could hit this bad in this area, this far inland in the mountains. I just think it was something, they call these 100-year floods. And I think it really was an unprecedented, historic, and not to sound cliche, but that's the type of storm it was. And I just don't think we could have really prepared for it.
Yeah. But I think people are better prepared for it now. I'll be honest with you. We still have water stocked up in our basement.
Same.
Like I said, people in our neighborhood have now switched how they're getting their internet. People are testing their water because they're still concerned about contamination. I think it's changed people here in Western North Carolina for maybe for the better.
Yeah. Tell me what it was like personally in each of your homes. Katie, you said a tree fell on your house. Were you inside? How did that happen?
So we weren't inside. My husband we were out of town for our 10th anniversary, and our daughter was staying with a friend in a different part of town. And we had a house sitter staying at our house to take care of our pets. And right before, cell service, right before she left cell service, she called me. We were in upstate New York, and said, screaming that a tree fell on our house. And of course, you're like, you don't know what that means, right? Like, okay, so a window got knocked out, a gutter fell down, or, total destruction, right? So we got in the car, tried to get a flight back to Asheville, couldn't. And so then we miraculously took back roads and got back into town, and the tree had destroyed.
You flew into Atlanta and then drove.
Right. And then had to drive in. Right. We tried to fly back into Asheville, but of course there were no flights in or out. And then when we got home, we realized our whole kitchen was destroyed and most of the back half of our house Yeah, it was. And like I said, on top of that, your friends and family who don't live here are trying to get a hold of you, but you have no cell phone service. So it was a really hard couple of days. It's almost, sometimes I don't even know how to describe it. And I don't know how we got through it.
Yeah. Because Katie was off, I was filling in for her on the morning show, and she texted me on the desk, and I saw it saying, "Oh my gosh, a tree just fell on my house. What's going on there?" And this was early in the morning, and it was very odd to be, anchoring during this time, because we knew it was bad, but the report, for the first couple of hours, we had reporters out live who we were concerned about. I mean, they were moving locations. You could see the flooding in the background, and, we wanted to make sure they were safe. And at the same time, we're doing phoners from emergency personnel, who are calling in saying, everyone stay home. Please don't be out in this. It's bad. And for a while, it felt like we didn't really know how bad it was, right? I remember asking, do we know how much damage, or people injured? Like what's going on out there? Because you were a little bit in a bubble in the studio. And for a while, I don't think they had a very good grasp of just how widespread the damage was. And then as the morning started to wear on, it became really clear that there was a lot of, human loss, a lot of buildings and homes and roads. And it really turned into a really scary situation. And on top of that, I mean, I think one of the hardest parts was just no communication. I mean, I couldn't get a hold of my husband to know if my family was okay. Katie was trying to get a hold of her daughter who was at another house. She couldn't get a hold of that family. I mean, it was just, you couldn't check on people. It was just, it's hard to describe. It was very, very scary day.
When we pulled back into town, it was like 11. So that storm came through on a Friday morning. We came back into town at like Friday at 11 o'clock. And it was almost apocalyptic. There were lines for people in trying to get gas, because of course that was another thing, right? Is that people were worried about running out of gas or trying to get out of town. There were ambulances trying to get into the gas stations. There, all the electricity was out. It was, but you couldn't believe it happened. Those first couple of days, it was like you were in a bad movie, and you had to pinch yourself just to make sure that you were really here and this was all really happening in Asheville. Yeah.
Karen, I was talking to Jason Boyer about trying to get into work that day, and his whole story of like chainsaw, like cutting down trees to get through on the roadway. So what was your ride home like when you're in this point where you didn't know what your kids were doing or how they were trying to get to them?
It was crazy I think we were on air for like 8 hours straight that morning, and we finally kind of switched people out. And I just started crying. I mean, I knew it was just such a terrible situation. And I remember turning to one of my managers and saying, I got to get home to my kids. And he said, I don't think you can make it. I don't think you can get there. And I said, well, I got to try. I can't just sit here. And so I started driving, and as Katie was saying, I mean, it really, I'm driving the interstate. There is no one on the interstate. And there are so many trees down on the interstate that you're literally weaving in and out of trees that have fallen. Trees aren't right along the interstate, right? They're pretty far off. And they were just crisscrossed all along. I made it all the way. And I remember thinking, if I can just get to my exit, I live close enough that I could walk. If I can get off the exit, I can leave my car and just walk to my house. And I managed to get, I was driving underneath trees that were being held up by power lines, and it was crazy. But I got to my street and ran inside the house, and my family was fine. It was unbelievable because, they lost power. Everybody lost power, I think around 4 that morning. And I mean, my husband knew there was a storm outside, but of course had no idea how bad it was. And he was like, I was like, oh my gosh, everybody's okay. I love you all, very emotional scene. And he's like, oh, we're good. We've just been, playing Barbies and trucks. And, is it bad out there? He's like, is my 3 o'clock going to be canceled? I was like, yeah, I think so. Like you just didn't know. And even we didn't really know how bad the rest of Western North Carolina was. I mean, that sounds
for
crazy,
days. I mean,
but
they were still looking for people. They were still looking, people were missing and they were still looking.
And I mean, unless we went into the studio, into work and had internet and email and social media access, you're totally in the dark. I mean, we were just living in this the whole weekend of our neighborhood and talking to people, and
the radio stations here did a really good job. Mm-hmm. It was sort of everybody's point of contact because, this is the truth. Not a lot of people could watch, you could stream us if you had internet, but not a lot of people could watch us on TV because they didn't have power. So the radio stations really stepped up. They just went wall to wall coverage, and people would call in. They would say they were about missing people, about where people could get supplies and water. That was a huge lifeline for people, which is funny. In 2025, you don't necessarily think that is going to be such a thing, but it was.
I mean, we dug out one of our kids' old CD players that had a radio setting, and they're like, "What is this we're listening to?" That's how I remember several neighbors were all at our house huddled around our kids' radio, trying to figure out what the next steps were. And I think, like I said, I think being cut off geographically, I mean, supplies took days to get in. It was just a very bizarre and scary time.
Yeah.
So in those days following, because, the Hurricane Center talks a lot about deaths in hurricanes and when they happen, and most of them don't happen in the initial onset of a hurricane making landfall. They happen in the days following because of power loss. So I'm curious about those days following. How long were you out of power? What did you do during those times? Going back and forth to work? How did you manage that week after the storm?
So the station runs on a generator. So it was the only place where we could shower. We have a shower here. So in terms of employees here, like friends and family, a lot of people came here and used the station. Some producers spent the night here. We had some producers whose houses were they couldn't go home. So that is what we did for showers and food. Some of the managers, left town to bring back food. It is funny. We will occasionally still there is a system in place that counts the hurricane deaths. And we will occasionally, it hasn't happened super recently, but I would say in the last couple of weeks, we will get, and they count this as a hurricane death, somebody who was cutting down tree branches or cutting down trees or trying to clear debris off their roof, and they fall and die. And that is considered a Hurricane Helene death because, of course, that contributed to the hurricane, contributed to their death. They wouldn't have been up there doing that. You're exactly right. There were people on oxygen who, couldn't use their oxygen. There were people who died of hypothermia, because they were cold inside their house. It's wet, it's rainy. Most of those deaths were elderly people who didn't have good support systems. But it is true, we will still get emails about updating the death toll from people who, would still be with us had the hurricane not rolled through. We were without water. So in Asheville, we were without water for about 2 weeks.
I think it was more than that.
3 weeks. But then this is the issue. The water came back on and it was not what they call potable. So we couldn't drink it. Some folks were bathing in it. They said you could. People were hesitant to do it. So even though water came back on, you would go to a restaurant and you couldn't have ice. And the restaurants were bringing in bottled water. You were using bottled water at your house. So that, that was, and so I'm trying to think, when did the water come back on? The hurricane happened at the very end of September, and I think November.
Yeah, I was going to say it was about a month with no water.
With no drinking water. I thought it was a couple. I mean, it was certainly a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
The line gets blurry after a while because, like I said, then the water came back on, but it wasn't a lot of use to you because you couldn't drink it.
And so Katie, you and your family ended up moving because of the damage to your house, moved to another house in another part of town for those couple of weeks.
Right.
We ended up, we stuck it out for a couple of days, and then honestly, we got to the point where we didn't have power for, I'd say 3 weeks. And, after a while, when you have 4 small children, your fridge is empty. It's not sustainable. All of the restaurants were closed. I mean, there was nowhere to, and the grocery stores. I mean, that's a whole other thing. I mean, there was days and days where the grocery stores weren't open. So,
or they would take cash and they would limit the amount of people that could shop. So you would wait in line with your cash to get, the things that milk and bread or whatever you needed.
So we kind of exhausted all of our pantry and, what we could salvage. And then we went to a friend's house about an hour and a half away. And so I was driving back and forth to work, but we were hunkered down there with all the kids and my husband was working remotely. But I think I would say most people in the initial week, a lot of people left town.
Mm. If you had the resources. They did set up personal care stations here in Western North Carolina where you could take a shower, do laundry. They were at, in the parking lots of grocery stores, that kind of thing, like a FEMA thing. So I think.
But I mean, it was a long time that we were, every other day driving to the locations to get cases of bottled water from the National Guard. Our kids kind of got used to like, okay, it's our water run, let's stock up, and which just was so bizarre. And I will say there was a lot of resources from FEMA, but also, churches, nonprofits really stepped up and did what they could. But in those initial weeks, it was just crazy.
What was the kids' reaction to all of this? Did they think it was an adventure?
Well, first we should also say schools were out for a long time. So obviously that was another big thing is schools were out indefinitely. I think they ended up going back about a month and a half later, but I'll let you say how River responded.
So believe it or not, River broke her arm. The hurricane happened on a Friday and River broke her arm on a Saturday, jumping off a swing at Karen's house. Believe it or not. So we ended up in the emergency room on that Sunday, which was, if you've never been to an emergency room during a disaster, I don't recommend it. I don't recommend it. It was scary. It was scary. There weren't clean linens.
They had no water.
They had no water. They were triaging people. So it was scary. I think, I hate to say this because I don't want to think about our kids being traumatized, but I think it was a pretty scary situation for River. I do. I think the whole thing. And in fact,
well, a tree fell on your house.
A tree fell on our house. That was really upsetting for her, as you might imagine. And then, the broken arm, the not going to school, even to this day, when you drive around certain parts of Asheville, it's destroyed. And I just think the whole thing was really, I think it was tough. I think it continues to be tough. We still talk about the hurricane. It's still brought up in our house.
Yeah, I think it's hard, So our kids are ages 3 to 9. And obviously the older ones are definitely more aware of what was happening. I think all of our kids were definitely very aware that they could see the trees down. And even the little ones who maybe didn't understand exactly what had happened could tell. Our youngest, I mean, it was months before he could walk outside and not say, is it safe? I mean, he every time would go outside and say, even if it was sunny, is it going to storm? Are we safe? I mean, I was amazed at age 2 at the time that he was so aware of the situation and what it was. And I think now now he doesn't bring that up. And I think he's probably mostly forgotten it, but the bigger kids haven't. And the other hard thing was, my husband and I mean, we're trying to figure out, do we leave town? Do we have enough food? How do we get water? I mean, it was scary. And we're talking about these things and, you don't want to hide it from your children, but you also don't want to alarm them, of course. So trying to explain to them that we're safe, it's going to be okay. But also we're like, are we okay? How is this going to play out? And being in news, I think added another element. I'm coming home, Katie and I are coming home every day out in these communities that are just, you can't help but cry. It's so emotional. You're reporting on these stories. You're sharing this devastating news every day on TV at work, and to then come home and kind of have to turn that off and just sort of act like things are going to be okay with your kids and try to, let's play a game in the dark with no power, and let's, kind of make it seem like it's not all doomsday. It was a really weird, I think, balancing act, and also just trying to figure out, at one point I remember one of my kids said, what does death toll mean? Obviously they had heard one of us say that, and it's like some really tough conversations with little kids about the fact that people here in our area died in this storm, and then also trying to make sure they understand that they're safe now. And one of the things that we talked about on our podcast in the aftermath of Helene was that there was an expert saying that you try to teach them that, like, here's how we're going to be safe next time. You don't want to overpromise and say this is never going to happen again or things like that. But okay, now we know to have water.
We have a plan.
We have a plan. We have water. And so that kind of, for the little kids, I think helps them in their heads to know, okay, we're prepared now. If it does happen again, here's what we do, type of situation.
Yeah, I think Hurricane Helene is probably going to be a core memory for our kids. And I mean, we talked about, especially early on, there's like in all of our lives, there's a before Helene and a after Helene now. Sometimes we'll even reference things like, well, when did that happen? It happened before Helene, and now this is after Helene, So yeah, I mean, I don't know. You hope it makes your kids stronger. I mean, Karen and I cried a lot of tears together and on our podcast just because, yeah, these are areas where, like, our favorite taco shop is like a barren shell, it looks like a bomb shelter went off, places that our kids did gymnastics, it's just places that are familiar and that you love and that you're used to going to. And that's like the least of it, right? Because we're not even talking about, the kids in our community who live just down the road who didn't make it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think too, I mean, we're 7 months out, and our personal drive from our house to our kids' school, maybe one building's been removed, but there are multiple collapsed buildings still. I mean, it looks very similar. There's still spray paint on the buildings, trespassing, looters will be shot. I mean, that sort of stuff. It still looks very similar as it did in the week after the hurricane today, 7 months later. And we drive that stretch every day. And so it's hard to help your kids get past it when you're all still seeing it every day. Now, I do think there's pockets of the communities, downtown really wasn't hit that bad. So I think if you're not in one of those areas, maybe you've moved on and it's a little bit easier, because some areas have, done a good job cleaning up and getting the debris removed and the damage cleared away. But I think there's definitely pieces that are still just have so far to go.
The Hurricane Center often talks about communication now as well, and the best way to get information to people. And you guys were stuck. There was no way to get information, at least when the storm hit and then after for a while. But given that you're both so entwined in the community, I'm wondering if you have any advice for them on how to communicate with places like Asheville or these little pockets communities that just didn't have the information to survive.
Well, that's a good question. I don't. I just feel like no one, and maybe now, like Katie said, with more Starlinks and other options, I just don't think anyone could have guessed. I mean, I'd never even seen that all of our cell phones had SOS, so we could not use them at all. I'd never even seen that logo before. Maybe other people are more familiar with it. I'm not tech savvy, but to not be able to do anything on your phone, call, text, internet, nothing. I don't know how you get around that to communicate.
I mean, I will say this, and this is one of those things, and you hear this and you see this, but I don't think, at least we never paid any attention to it because we don't live in Florida. You know what I mean? Like, we don't live in the plains where there's tons of tornadoes. I think having a plan, like, where would you go if something like a tree hit your house, or you get, one of the things that happened is that people got scattered, right? So where would your family meet if you're in sort of emergency and you get, separated? Having those kind of conversations now before something like this hits and you really don't have communication, I think is really huge. And, you don't need to be an alarmist about it. But like I said, now we do have water stockpiled in our garage, which I think I'd be willing to bet that everybody here in Asheville will.
I mean, I won't leave. I have 3 bottles of water in my car at all times,
right.
just because I'm so panicked about it now.
We had headlamps in our car and our consoles. It's just something to think about so that when this sort of thing does happen, you're not scrambling. And radios. Don't they always say to have weather radios? I mean, huge.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if I could dial it back and be in a different place before this hit, I would have a bag of bottled water, non-perishable food for 3 days. I don't know, weather radio, headlamps, batteries, those sorts of things ready to go in a bag, and just kind of have that conversation with my husband and the kids, perhaps. Just because I feel like if nothing else, you did something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you knew you had at least something to go off of.
Were there any foods that you grew to love that you depended on that were non-perishable?
You know what we did? This is not really an answer to that question, but as we were, that your fridge, everything's going to go, right? And so we pretty early on put a bunch of stuff in a big cooler. And then on the last day, I remember we got to the bottom and there was 2 frozen pizzas, which of course we couldn't cook in the oven, but my husband put them on the grill.
And they were good?
And they were amazing. Who knew a frozen pizza on a grill? Okay. But that was the last bit of propane. And then we ran out of propane. We fortunately had like a camping stove, so we were able to do some stuff. But when we ran out of propane, my husband said, it's time to go. Our cooler is empty. We've eaten frozen pizzas on the grill. Yeah. The propane's out. Yeah. We got to get out of town.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that just sticks in my memory of like,
Yeah. We bought all these hiking bars because we were supposed to be hiking in upstate New York for this anniversary trip. And like we ate those stupid protein bars for like 6 days in my house. In fact, people came over to like help us cut the tree off. And I was like, protein bar? People thought that was the occasion in which we would, just not what we anticipated while we were eating them. But yeah, I mean, I do want to say this because I know, Emily, you have been to Asheville recently. Asheville is open for business. I don't want people to hear this podcast and think, oh gosh, we can't come to Asheville. There are certain spots that are not open, like the River Arts District, portions of Swannanoa, portions of Biltmore Village. But a lot of Asheville and Western North Carolina is ready for folks to come back and come visit because tourism is our lifeblood here. And I think if you're a tourist here, I think that you would be surprised that Asheville is still up and running.
Yeah, very good point, Katie. And I think that, we've been doing stories and talking to small businesses who are just in a really desperate situation. I mean, tourism is our main industry here, especially in the Asheville area. And downtown is really it's back. And they are desperate to get folks back in here. We're really hoping this spring kind of brings a lot more people back that we need it.
Yeah, I love Asheville. I went to college there. I interned at WLOS. And so we go back frequently and it's beautiful, but there's also some really good deals right now because in the past, it's been really expensive certain times of year to find an Airbnb or a hotel. And there's some really great deals right now too. So, and like you said, I was just there recently and it was beautiful. We did drive around just to kind of see where there is damage, but you're right. There are pockets and then there are other areas that are great.
Right. That
downtown
totally normal. Yeah.
You talked about, how to communicate with people and how to get information to people. But as mothers, I'm curious, maybe the next generation is how we get that information to people. So how are you teaching your kids about how to prepare for hurricanes or weather disasters in general?
That's a good question.
I know.
I feel like for our kids, just living through this has taught them so much. I think now they know, like we said a little bit earlier, we need a plan. We need to have bottled water. I think that they definitely remember those days and here's how we roll from very early on. I remember saying like, we're going to get through this as a family. We're going to rely on each other. Let's stay positive. We can do this. We can do hard things. We can get through this. So I think just having that kind of mentality and having that experience of knowing that they've been through this horrific natural disaster, and could do it again. Hopefully not, but if that ever happens. And I think just I talked a little bit about the balance, but just being open with them about what was happening. And, I do think you don't want to necessarily sugarcoat it and say, this is never going to happen again, because I think it's unfortunately a real possibility.
I mean, I hope not, but yeah, you just never know. You just never know in these
Well,
times.
there's the wildfires. I mean, natural disasters come in all different forms, and you guys have had no shortage of them this year.
But it's an interesting thing to think about what the kids will take away from this. And to your point, how to communicate with them better. And, down the road, I think you're asking all the right questions about how do we better prepare and how do we better get information? I mean, it was really, really hard for us as TV news journalists to be in a position where we were getting the information in that first week and literally no one could. It was like we were shouting into a hole, right? Like we were broadcasting. Thank you.
The outside world is watching
all of this information, and then we would see, all of our neighbors and friends who we would see face to face would say, we can't watch. You have to just tell us, face to face, because we can't get this information. It was so frustrating to have that info and not, because that's kind of our jobs, right? That's what we do, is we share information with people. And it was really tricky to be in that position for a couple of weeks where no one could get us.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess that's also what's nice about living in the digital era, because almost everybody knew where they could get service. You could drive somewhere. And a lot of people relied on social media, on Facebook, on Instagram, that kind of thing.
You would drive to like a church and get a self-service spot.
You might not have been able to like turn on, flip your remote and turn on your TV, but you could see what we were posting on the socials. So yeah.
Has this changed you as a mom?
I think it has. I don't see how it couldn't change us.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it was such a tough thing to go through. I think it's changed. I think it's changed me as a mom, just because it's something that I never thought I would live through and have to help my children navigate through. And I'm going to get emotional. It was really scary and it was a really tough time. And I think it's hard to process that and go through that as an adult, but then you're also trying to help your children go through that. And it was, I don't know. It was really tricky those first couple of weeks. And even afterward, I mean, school wasn't back in session for almost 2 months. I mean, there was a long time that we were in this weird zone, of seeing a lot of destruction, dealing with it, processing it. And it's just, when it's hard for you as a 40-something-year-old, it's hard for these kids who are 5, 6, 8, who are also realizing something big and terrible has happened. And what do we do now?
Yeah. I think it's definitely made us more resilient. And just, even just on a practical level, I feel like I have a better understanding of what it is going to take to get through a natural disaster. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, just as a family, I feel like we have the sort of the practical means and we know the measures we have to take. But when River broke her arm and we were going to the emergency room and there were FEMA trucks outside and they were triaging people in the emergency room, it was terrifying. And I'm proud. I'm proud at how well River was able. She was like, as soon as we walked in that emergency room, I started crying and she was like, Mom, get it together. Like, let's to get it together, So yeah, it's just funny what your kids can kind of teach you as well, right? Like they had to go back to school and deal with all of this. And, I think it's going to make I think it's made me a different person and a better person. And I think it's definitely built some resilience in her. Now she knows. Yeah.
Really cool thing that I think all of our kids got to see was, and this sounds maybe cliche, but I mean, our neighborhood are the people directly around us. I mean, we still text who, we may have waved at them, but we weren't really close. I mean, it really brought communities together, which was really, I think, a special thing to share and to teach our children, that it was almost kind of like you're rewinding back decades to where you hung out face to face more with people that live on your street. My kids still write cards and put them in the mailboxes of some of our elderly folks who we got to know really well and shared meals with, and, had this really crazy experience together. It was really powerful how I think neighbors and communities and families took care of each other in those first couple of days. And that's something that I really hope they remember. And I think has changed me, and I hope has taught them that we need to care for each other.
Yeah.
Well, Thank you so much for revisiting this trauma with me. I'm sorry that we brought it all up, but I think it's such great, useful information for other people, for other moms, and just for disaster preparation as well. So I appreciate your time.
Yeah. Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Thanks.